Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, prompted by a couple of interesting pieces of UK-EU relations reports written by actual experts, I'd like to discuss where the main sources of pressure on the Labour government may need to be in terms of getting the momentum going now that we've got a government that is at least facing the right direction. Because under the Conservatives, the scale of opposition to their Brexit-related policies was as easy as it was overwhelming. It was all in the wrong direction. Divergence for the sake of divergence. It gave us no benefits. The Tories are still unable to point to any real benefits, only harms. Even the rare mini victories, such as the constant deferment of UKCA requirements that have basically been dropped now, the Windsor Framework, rejoining Horizon, they weren't moves in the right direction. They were simply standing still instead of moving further in the wrong direction. But now we have a government who are openly wanting closer relations with the EU and on everything. There is no policy area where Labour are not saying we want closer relations with the EU. So they're facing in the right direction on everything. So it's just really now a case of, so which paths are they willing to walk down and which ones are they not but should? Because there's no shortage of Brexit commentators saying, well, we should just join the single market. Yet you won't find a single UK-EU trade or policy expert saying the same thing. I've said a few times before, we have to be wary of ending up like Brexiteers in demanding things which aren't achievable because someone in the media told us they were, without ever considering if they knew what they were talking about. Yes, leaving the single market and the customs union, which the customs union, too many seem to downplay the effect of that, has cost us a great deal. And yes, joining them again would unlock huge benefits. But there are too many barriers to doing that, not just in the UK. As I said recently, the EU are not interested in discussing very much at all in the way of future agreements until we've demonstrated our commitment to existing agreements. You know, Luigi Scazzieri, an expert on European security, was recently writing about the UK's attempts to discuss security arrangements with the EU. The EU wants something quick. I was, at the time I was talking about this, I was very excited about this. The UK wants something quick, albeit not binding, because something binding would take too long. And I said, oh, this is great. This is the Labour government really wanting to push very quickly in an effort to start the ball rolling on closer cooperation between the UK and the EU. The idea is that the sooner we start cooperating in more areas, the sooner we can be talking to each other on a more regular basis, and the sooner we get that dialogue going. Because one of the biggest things we lost leaving the EU, which is not talked about really very much, was UK officials and politicians talking to their counterparts from other countries about their own politics, like on a regular basis. It might sound mad, but officials and politicians of the EU don't really know what the UK wants because we haven't been having those little candid discussions with them. All they can do is read what's in the media. And outside the EU, the only time we can now talk to them like this is in high-profile summits and meetings where there's a big media spotlight on them. And that can only happen a few times a year. These conversations used to happen every week. So we've had a breakdown in understanding between us. So the urgency on the part of the UK is understandable, but Scazzieri argues that actually this approach is likely to fail. What we need is a slower approach. That stands a much better chance of success with the EU, which is a problem. We've had the same sort of arguments from EU trade and other policy experts in other areas of common interest as well. You're actually going to have to take this slowly, which is counter to what we want and what many of the more high-profile commentators are saying. The fact of the matter is, as I've said recently, if you read what actual experts are saying, they're saying that substantial progress is going to be slow. And if you try go too quickly, you'll just end up failing and then have to start again and go slow. It's the EU who want the progress to be slow, and there's a number of reasons for this. First is the EU have made clear themselves, from their point of view, what is the point of rushing into new agreements when the UK still hasn't complied with the deals we agreed several years ago? Like eat your greens before you can have your pudding, basically. And that's the EU saying that. That's not our government. Second, the EU need to know what it is the UK actually wants. And because of the political situation in this country, even I don't know exactly what our government wants. And I try and pay very careful attention. And we need to then, once we've worked out what we want, need to compare that with what the EU want, which naturally takes time in the EU under any circumstances, because the EU isn't this centralised power as described in our useless media. It is actually a democratic coalition of many different stakeholders, over two dozen different national governments, a lot of different parties in the EU Parliament, and the Commission has to take account of all of the different needs and red lines within that coalition. That takes time, even if they knew what the UK actually wanted, which they don't, because our discussions with them are now way less frequent. Third, the EU have other things to be dealing with as well. It's the EU Commission which will be driving discussions on any future agreements, but you know what? They're quite busy. They're also conducting their normal business of discussing arrangements with countries around the world, as well as managing the climate emergency, potential political instability in America, the small matter of an invasion of Europe going on. Now, this is not to say that Labour have got it all in hand. They're pushing as hard as they can, and it's just a matter of waiting for the EU to be willing to move. There are some areas of political blockage in the UK. It's just not necessarily the ones where people are pushing. So pushing the single market line, by all means do it, as I've said, by all means, because we want a discussion going. But don't complain when nothing happens, because nothing can happen. That's because the Labour government want to discuss access to the single market. In fact, what Labour are proposing would mean better access to the single market in the short and medium term than actually just trying to join the single market in one go. Where the blockage is at our end is not Labour's ambition, but the spectre of freedom of movement and the role of the European Court of Justice, as well as the fear of Brexit tearing the country apart again. Like, you take the veterinary agreement, for example. The easiest way to achieve this, according to EU trade expert Sam Lowe, is simple. Align relevant standards with the EU. Now, this shouldn't be a political problem. Starmer said before the election, during the time when the old Ming vase was being carried across the highly polished floor, he said, yeah, no problem with aligning any standards which help trade. Just straight out. He could say that, so of course he can say it now. And the King's speech contained legislation which would allow ministers to do this quickly and easily. So we have no problem, our government has no problem with aligning any standards which will reduce trade barriers. But there is a problem. Disputes. You will always get disputes. There will always be a trade dispute where one company says, oh, you haven't complied with the terms of this contract or something. And where there is a trade dispute, inevitably it's going to go to court. Which court oversees that? Well, the European Court of Justice is the final arbiter of EU rules, and you will be operating in a framework of EU rules. But when it comes to knocking down trade barriers with the EU, these are the two major political problems in the UK, which ignoring doesn't help. So the first is freedom of movement, or anything which sounds like freedom of movement. Now, that doesn't impact the veterinary agreement. But the second is the role of the European Court of Justice, which the Telegraph and the Mail will go loopy at. Lowe thinks that because of this, the Labour government might try for something weaker than a comprehensive veterinary agreement, meaning some barriers will remain, just to avoid that row over the European Court, at least at this stage. And British voter concerns about freedom of movement will also hamper other efforts, most notably the potential for the youth movement deals we've talked about. That is something the EU have been keen on, although the recent riots, may have made those more difficult as well. These are the areas I would suggest pressure needs to be focused. Simply waving our arms about and talking about joining the single market, when it's administratively impossible, just generates a lot of noise, which we need. We need the noise. But that's it. It doesn't actually achieve anything of practical importance, unless once you've generated that noise, you get single. Here's where we need to specifically focus. Like, that's what I would say. The focus needs to be where the real blockages are. And in the UK, we can't do much about the blockages on the EU side, other than acknowledge that they are there, and they've come as a result of the fact that we've been a bad faith actor for the last few years. Don't pretend the EU would welcome us back next Tuesday if we just asked. But we can do something about the blockages on the UK side. We need to be honest about where they are. We have to accept that people in the UK don't want another divisive Brexit debate splitting families and friends apart. So we need boring incremental deals which make things better over time, which works because 100% of every EU expert I read is saying this is what the EU want anyway. But where there is work to be done, it is in persuading people in this country that freedom of movement is beneficial. Not just that it's not harmful, that it's beneficial. That ending it has hurt us. For those with immigration concerns, and despite how it might be counterintuitive for them, experts said leaving the EU would lead to an increase in immigration. What's happened? Record immigration. And you just say to these people, I get how it looks, I get how it's sort of, but immigration went up when we left. And it was always going to go up, and the experts said it would go up. It was only Farage that said they'd go down, so who should you listen to? The data's clear, even if they don't understand how it's clear. And as for the role of the European Court of Justice, why would ordinary people care? Ask someone who's, I don't like the idea of that. When was the last time you had any dealings with the ECJ? we're going to find that public resistance to a role for the ECJ is going to be self-defeating. If we could persuade more people that smashing these trade barriers frees up supply chains, which means not only do the food and medicine shortages not as bad, I mean, everyone's got tales of food and medicine shortages, but the costs are kept down as well. I think opposition to the role of a court they don't understand sort of melts away when you're saying to people, yeah, but if we just accept that they get to deal with disputes, and you've never had a dispute, personally as a consumer anyway, then we get easier access to food and medicines and they're a bit cheaper. But those are the conversations to have on the UK end, making the European Court of Justice and freedom of movement issues which are not politically sensitive. That would unlock so many things. But it's not the government we need to persuade. They already know that. Even the Tories know that. It's the people. Try to have conversations with people who will listen. Some won't listen. You could maybe write articles for your local paper or something. Be nice if the government itself tried and succeeded in leading debate on that, but that is hoping someone else does something. If we want to help get things moving ourselves, I'd say talk up the benefits of freedom of movement, point out where it's actually hurt us, that losing them, talk up the benefits of removing trade barriers, acknowledging that this means the ECJ will oversee disputes, but we've never, just say there's never been a problem with this in the past. It's never hurt anyone. And also that I doubt any ordinary voter in this country can raise any practical objection to why that should be anyway. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.